Welcome back. This is week 11 of the 2025 Bluewater Auto Restoration podcast. We release new podcasts every Saturday morning. Tune in here for all your classic car news. In this deep dive, we look at SU carburetors. Visit BlueWaterAutoRestoration.com website. Our podcasts are available on Spotify, Google Music, YouTube, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or SoundCloud. Let's dive into the fascinating history of the SU carburetor. It all started back in 1905, when George Skinner developed and patented it. And honestly, it was a pretty revolutionary idea for its time.
I mean, think about it. We're talking over a century ago, and this design hasn't changed all that much. That says something about how well it works, right?
Exactly. The beauty of the SU lies in its simplicity. Unlike most carburetors that rely on complex systems of springs and levers, the SU operates on this sleek, variable Venturi design. And here's where it gets interesting. It uses the Venturi effect to control air and fuel flow.
Wait, the Venturi effect? You're going to have to break that down for us regular folks.
All right, imagine a tube that's narrower in the middle. As air passes through that narrow part, it gets faster, and the pressure drops. That drop in pressure pulls fuel into the airstream, creating the mixture that powers the engine. What makes the SU unique is how it adjusts the size of that narrow part, the Venturi, dynamically. It's essentially self-regulating.
Kind of like it knows what the engine needs, when it needs it. That's, well, pretty genius for a little carburetor.
And that's also why it became such a hit with manufacturers. SU carburetors were used in cars from Jaguar to MG to Triumph, and not just British brands. Volvo and Saab used them too, even Datsun with their licensed versions.
Yeah, Datsuns didn't just copy it. They literally bought the rights to make their own versions through Hitachi. It's wild how far-reaching this little invention was.
And it all comes down to that piston needle mechanism. As the engine draws in more air, the piston rises, which widens the Venturi and adjusts the fuel flow through a tapered needle. That taper ensures the right mix of air and fuel at any given time. The precision of that needle, down to specific diameters, is what made the SU stand out from other carburetors.
Yeah, and, I was reading somewhere that each needle has like 9 or 16 different measurements along its length. That's just meticulous engineering.
It really is, and it's why these carburetors dominated for decades. But then came the elephant in the room: emissions regulations. By the 1980s, those standards made the SU's design less practical, leading to its decline in favor of more modern fuel injection systems.
It's kind of sad, in a way, like seeing a legendary athlete retire, They dominated for so long, but eventually, technology moves on.
True. But for those of us who love working on vintage cars, the SU carburetor is still a beloved piece of engineering. It's simple, reliable, and surprisingly elegant in how it operates.
And honestly, it's part of what gives those classic cars their charm. Like, you can feel the history under the hood when you're working with an SU carburetor.
Exactly. And that history is what keeps them alive in so many enthusiasts' minds today. They're a direct link to the golden age of British motoring. So now that we've explored the rich history of SU carburetors, let's shift gears and talk about the practical side. Figuring out the different types. Those letters and numbers stamped on them, they're not just random markings. They're like a secret code that tells you exactly what you're working with.
Right? Like the HS4 and HIF6 we see on old MGs? I always wondered what those meant.
Exactly. Let's break it down. The first letter, usually an H, stands for horizontal, which is the type of airflow. Then you've got other letters. S, for instance, can mean side float or short body, depending on the carb. And then there are the numbers. Those tell you the throat size. Every 1/8 inch over 1 inch gets a number. So, an HS4 is 1 4/8 inches in diameter, or 112 inches.
Oh, so an HIF6 would be, what, 134 inches? Since 6/8 equals 3/4? That actually makes sense now.
Exactly. You've got it. Knowing these designations is key when identifying which carburetor fits your vehicle or when sourcing parts. Speaking of which, Let's dive into restoration. The first step for most enthusiasts is dealing with wear and tear, especially on the throttle shafts and bushings.
Yeah, that's a big one. Those parts wear out all the time, and if they're not right, can't that mess with your tuning?
Absolutely. Worn throttle shafts create vacuum leaks, which make it nearly impossible to tune the carburetor properly. There are three common solutions for this. 1. Replace the shafts if the bushings aren't too worn. 2. Ream the bushings slightly to fit oversized shafts. And 3. Completely replace the bushings with new ones and use standard shafts.
So that last option's the most thorough, but probably the most work. Huh?
You've got it. And while replacing bushings might require special tools like a reaming kit, it's an essential step for a proper rebuild. After that, you're looking at rebuilding components like jets and needles, which are responsible for fuel flow.
And that's the part where you better double-check your patience, huh? Those tiny needles have to be perfect, or your fuel mix is off.
Exactly. The needles are precision machined to specific diameters along their length, so they match the air and fuel requirements at different flow levels. If they're even slightly off, it can throw your engine's performance completely out of whack.
Which is why, for some people, just buying new carbs might save the headache. But there's something satisfying about tackling a rebuild yourself, don't you think?
Oh, definitely. For those who want to maintain originality, especially for car shows, a rebuild is often the way to go. Companies like Berlin Fuel Systems still produce brand new parts for most classic SUs, so sourcing what you need isn't as tough as people think.
And sometimes those rebuilt ones are even better than new, especially if you're comparing them to modern replacements. I mean, there's just something about putting that extra care into restoring the originals, right?
Absolutely. The original carbs are often better suited for specific vehicles because they were designed with those setups in mind. Plus, doing it yourself saves a bit of cash, though that depends on how far you want to take it. Polishing parts or replating linkages can add quite a bit to the cost if you're going for concours quality.
But you know, even if you don't go for show-level perfection, just getting those carbs back on the car and running right, it's kind of like bringing a piece of history back to life.
It really is. And whether you rebuild it yourself or partner with a professional, the end result is always worth it. Restoring an SU carburetor isn't just about function. It's a nod to the engineering and craftsmanship that makes these classics so special. Now that we've discussed the ins and outs of restoring SU carburetors, the next step is tuning them to perfection. Tuning, at its core, is all about balance, finding that sweet spot where performance, drivability, and efficiency come together seamlessly. To start, I usually focus on the fundamentals, like synchronizing multiple carburetors.
Ah yes, the synchronization dance. I've seen that done with those fancy tools, and even with a piece of garden hose.
Exactly. A synchronization tool gives you precise readings, but for a low buck method, you can use a hose. You simply listen to the sound the carbs make, and when they match, you know they're in sync. It's not as precise as a tool, but it works well enough for most enthusiasts.
And revving the engine a little during adjustments helps, right?
Definitely, it clears out the carbs and ensures everything functions correctly. Once the carbs are synchronized, you move on to the throttle linkage. You want to make sure that the throttle arms start moving at the same time when you push the accelerator.
That's such a small detail, but makes a huge difference when you actually drive. What's next after the linkage?
Next is the idle mixture. This step is crucial because it ensures the proper air-fuel ratio at idle. On an SU, you lift the piston slightly, about a 1/16 of an inch. If the engine speed drops, the mixture's too lean. And if it rises too much, it's too rich. You keep adjusting until it just rises a tiny bit before settling back down.
Oh man, the piston lift dance. Feels like an art form, doesn't it?
It really does. And once that's done, there's the choke adjustment. Though, as we've talked about, it's not really a choke in the traditional sense. On an SU, the jet's lower to enrich the mix for starting, and the linkage, and cam need to be set properly so it works smoothly.
Got it. Now let's talk about spicing things up a bit. Performance mods. What can people do if they're looking to squeeze a little more out of their SUs?
Great question. A common modification is changing the needle profile to adjust the air-fuel mixture across the entire throttle range. Needles come in categories like weak, standard, or rich, so you can tailor them to your engine's needs.
And for the DIY rebels, they even sand their own needle profiles, right? That's some next-level tinkering.
It really is. Another mod is improving airflow by replacing the later style throttle discs, which have spring-loaded poppet valves, with earlier flat discs. These poppet valves were for emissions, but they can restrict airflow.
So ditching them can give you a noticeable boost? Nice. What about stuff like velocity stacks or performance filters?
Absolutely. Adding something like K filters or TWM velocity stacks can increase airflow and give you a couple more horsepower. But keep in mind, with velocity stacks, you might not be able to run an air filter effectively, so that's a trade-off.
You're basically trading a little practicality for performance. But hey, for some folks, it's about peak fun, right?
Exactly. Just make sure any modifications align with your goals, whether it's track-ready performance or improving daily drivability. And whatever you choose, basic maintenance needs to stay front and center.
Here we go. Harper's maintenance checklist. What's priority number 1?
Throttle shaft condition. Worn shafts or bushings cause vacuum leaks, which affect tuning. Repairs range from replacing the shafts to completely reaming out and replacing the bushings. If you skip this, the best tuning in the world won't matter.
So basically, get the foundation solid first. And what about leaks? Any other big red flags to watch for?
Yes, vacuum leaks are a big one. A quick check around the carb and intake manifold can save you a lot of headaches. Also, pay attention to gaskets, rubber seals, and float bowl needles. They're all small parts that carry a big responsibility for optimal performance.
It's all in the details, huh? But once you've sorted all that, these little beauties can run like new again, or maybe even better.